Welcome to part 6. The unbreakable vow? That's what he said? Ron asked, making sure he'd heard his best friend right. Yeah. I've said it 3 times now. What is it? Harry asked, looking a bit tired. He and Daphne had returned to Slughorn's party after overhearing Draco and Snape. The party had gone on very late, and Harry and Daphne had suffered the awkward, and sometimes grating, questioning by fellow students. Harry was sure that by breakfast there would be hundreds of rumors centered around Harry and Daphne's relationship. When they said goodnight in the entrance hall, it had seemed to Harry that Daphne had wanted to ask him something, or that something important was on her mind. She had looked as if she was on the verge of saying something to him several times, but had finally just bade him good night and walked briskly down to the dungeons. The unbreakable vow is like the ultimate promise. If you make it, and you don't hold up your end, you die. Fred and George tried to make me take it when I was younger, but Dad found us. I've never seen him so mad in my life. He put Mum to shame that night. George still says his left buttock has never been the same. Ron chuckled a bit. Well, then, let's hope Draco fails. It might end 2 of our problems. Harry said dryly, remembering Snape's threat from the previous night. So, Charlie's going to be home this year. Yeah, that's what Mum said anyway. It'll be really cool to catch up with him. I suppose Bill and Fleur will be there as well. Ron looked out the window, anticipating the holiday. And the presents. You think your mum's lightened up on her yet? Who knows? Ron shrugged. I suppose she'll be all over you when she finds out about you and Hermione. Harry grinned. Ron's face went crimson, and his eyes looked about to pop. What's wrong with you? Hermione asked Ron as she re-entered their compartment. I just asked him what he thought Mrs. Weasley was going to say when she found out about you 2 being together. Harry said, still grinning madly. I'd be more concerned over her opinion on you and a certain Slytherin girl. Given her treatment of Fleur, I doubt Mrs. Weasley would be any better to Daphne. Hermione said, a hint of threat in her tone. She was glaring hard at Harry, who looked defiant. I never said it would be me who spilled the beans. Ron does have a sister who's seen the 2 of you together. Ginny's no idiot. I'll even lay odds she'll be the one to announce it at dinner tonight, especially if it means getting Fred and George to stop harassing her about Dean. Well, thank goodness I'm going home. I doubt I could handle Fred and George ribbing me about it all night. Hermione looked a bit frightened at the possibility. Oh, man. Those 2 aren't going to give me a moment's peace. Ron frowned, burying his head in his hands. Hermione began rubbing his back, trying to comfort him. The door to the compartment opened, and Daphne and Tracy poked their heads in. Do you mind if we join you? Daphne asked, looking a bit haggard. She was dressed in black pants and a dark green sweater that hugged her torso nicely. Her blonde hair was swept up in a lazy ponytail, and she looked tired. Come right in. Hermione nodded, motioning for the 2 Slytherin girls to take a seat. Thanks. Tracy smiled gratefully. These 2 made quite the impression last night. People won't stop coming in and asking stupid questions. I expected something, but it's getting out of hand. Daphne sighed, sitting next to Harry. Pansy Parkinson started in on me before breakfast, telling me I was an idiot and I could do better. Then, Malfoy asked how much I was paid, and basically called me a slag. I really hate him. Isn't sitting here with us only going to fuel the fire? Harry asked, looking a bit confused and worried. Most likely. Daphne smiled coyly. But people seem afraid of you for some reason. So at least while I'm in here, I'll be left alone. Glad I could help. Harry said sarcastically, rolling his eyes. So, I'd love to hear about the party. Tracy smiled. I haven't heard anything about it, other than Harry had obviously used a love potion on Daphne to get her to come with him. Or, that one about Harry using the Imperious Curse. That was a good one, too. What? Harry shouted, nearly falling from his seat. I would never do that kind of thing. Relax, Harry. Daphne said, helping him to sit back. They're just rumors. We talked about this, remember? Harry nodded, his demeanor falling into one of exasperated displeasure. He had known that the talk would begin the moment they stepped into that party together, and he had known full well what some of the rumors would say. So, he couldn't figure out why he was so upset over it. There had been talk of Harry being a dark wizard on the rise before, and it always went away. But this time was different, because this time someone else was involved. So, how was the party? Tracy asked again. Really good. Ron spoke up. The food was really good, and there were a lot of interesting people. How would you know? Hermione asked, looking anguished. You spent the whole night talking to Gweenock Jones about Quidditch. You completely forgot about me unless you needed a refill on your punch. Oi, mate. Harry moaned, wiping his face with his hands. You're an idiot. What? How often will I get to talk to a famous Quidditch captain? Ron looked confused. Well, Harry was a perfect gentleman. Always introducing me when Slughorn forgot I was there, which was about every single time we met someone new. Daphne smiled proudly. She missed the sidelong glance that Tracy threw to Hermione. I still say the most interesting part was what we learned about Draco. Harry sighed. Draco. He was there. Tracy looked confused. He says he crashed, but the truth is he got caught by Filch. Harry believes he's been marked by you-know-who. Daphne rolled her eyes. And, he's going to bring about our doom. Wait, didn't we hear Pansy telling Millie about Draco getting marked? Tracy asked, leaning forward. Back in the beginning of the year. Daphne scrunched her nose as she thought back to the beginning of the year. She made it a habit to ignore Pansy as much as possible, as the only thing Pansy seemed good for was taking up space, and blowing hot air. Or, if the stories were true, to be Draco's personal slag. Still, Daphne did overhear many of Pansy's conversations in the common room. But this specific conversation took place in the dorm, late one night after Pansy had come in, crying about one thing or another. It had seemed that Draco and Pansy were on the outs, as they were hardly ever seen together anymore. That night, Pansy had come into their room, tears falling down her face, and she had flopped on her bed. Daphne remembered that she and Tracy had been talking with Millie, who was always so nice when Pansy wasn't around. And the look of resigned loyalty as Millie went over to comfort her friend. He thinks he's so special now. A real big shot or something. Like all he's got to do is show off that stupid mark and everyone will bend to his whim. Pansy had said disgustedly. You're right. Daphne said, slapping her forehead. I totally forgot about it. But, we don't know if it's true. We've never seen it, and I doubt that Pansy has either. Draco most likely just told her he was marked to make himself seem more important. But, there's really a chance that he does have the mark? Hermione asked, looking to the two Slytherin girls in turn. I suppose. Draco does lie about a lot, but sometimes he'll tell the truth if he thinks it'll get him what he wants. Tracy shrugged. Is there any way we can find out for sure? Harry asked. If he were on the train we could find out. But he stayed at the castle for the holiday. Tracy shrugged as she leaned back into her seat. Harry felt himself deflate. He was always so close to finding out the truth about his nemesis. It was becoming more and more vexing. If he could get some real proof, perhaps then Dumbledore would take the threat seriously. "Are you going to meet my parents on the platform?" Daphne asked of Harry, who looked suddenly frightened. He noticed the other three in the compartment staring interestedly at them. "I suppose I could say hello," Harry said softly. "I'm sure they'd both really like the chance to at least say hello. Of course, they'll get a better chance to talk to you on Christmas. But it would be nice if you met them before that." Daphne smiled. Sure was all Harry could manage. The train pressed on towards London. The five teens kept up a nice stream of conversation. After a while, Harry, who'd mostly just listened to the others speaking, finally drifted off to sleep. He had been exhausted, but had slept very little. Daphne had noticed Harry fall asleep, and kept glancing at him, wondering why he looked so troubled as he slept. Most people found peace in their dreams, but Harry seemed to twitch and lightly moan as he slept. Daphne wanted to reach out and try to ease him, but her own embarrassment kept her from doing anything. Especially after she caught Tracy grinning at her accusingly. The Hogwarts Express was met by hundreds of anxious and excited parents, who greeted their children happily before quickly leaving. For fear of a Death Eater attack. The newspaper had been full of reports of deaths, disappearances, and destruction. It had the whole of the wizarding world clearly on edge. "Daphne," called a feminine voice as Daphne stepped from the train. "Mum." Daphne waved politely and made her way through the crowd to be embraced by her mother. Again, Tracy's speech from a few weeks ago echoed in her mind. Nothing makes you feel as strong, or invincible, or relaxed, or even at peace than when your mum gives you a good strong hug. And tells you it's all going to be okay. You believe her because she loves you. It's so good to see you," Aurora Greengrass said as she released her eldest daughter. "How has the term been?" "I know what you're trying to ask, Mother," Daphne said calmly. She had finally let go of her anger towards her parents over the contract. Aurora looked at her daughter proudly, knowing that Daphne had made an effort to talk to her betrothed during the term. Aurora had to admit that she was hungry for details, but knew better than to push Daphne. The girl would reveal it all in her own time. As it was, the 16-year-old was scanning the crowd. "Ah, there he is," she said as she waved her arm, and a young man with untidy black hair and round glasses waved back. The boy approached the two women, looking apprehensive. "Mother, I'd like you to meet Harry Potter." "Harry, my mother, Aurora Greengrass." Daphne smiled politely as she introduced the two. "It's very nice to meet you," Harry said, offering his hand, which Mrs. Greengrass took happily. Mrs. Greengrass was a few inches taller than Daphne, but looked as if she were but an older sister to the girl. She was dressed smartly in a winter cloak and warm hat. Her cheeks were rosy with the cold, and her smile was warm and friendly. She had Daphne's same deep, dark brown eyes, though Mrs. Greengrass were a bit friendlier than Daphne's. "It is indeed a pleasure to meet you again, Mr. Potter. The last time we met, you were still a baby in your mother's arms." Mrs. Greengrass smiled. "Mum." The three of them turned as a younger girl wrapped her arms tightly around Mrs. Greengrass. "Astoria. So good to see you." Mrs. Greengrass grinned, embracing her youngest. "I didn't know you had a sister," Harry whispered. "I have a sister," Daphne said. "Not much else to say. To be honest, Astoria and I have never been especially close. Too much sibling rivalry, I guess. She's really into sports and things like that. I'm more conservative, I guess. Mr. Potter, if you have time, there is someone else I'd like you to meet," Mrs. Greengrass said, turning back to Daphne and Harry. Harry glanced over to where Mrs. Weasley was standing. Watching him carefully, a strange look of confused reservation on her face. Ron and Ginny were with her, waiting for him to join them. He held up a hand to signal it would be another moment, and Mrs. Weasley nodded, a bright smile appearing on her face. "I have a moment or two," he said politely. "Good. She'd never let me hear the end of it if I didn't try." Mrs. Greengrass' smile was enchanting. "Nana's here." Both Greengrass girls looked hopefully at their mother, who nodded in confirmation. "Yes." Astoria shouted gleefully. "Where is she?" "Waiting for us near the portal." "Come now, let's not keep her waiting," Mrs. Greengrass said, leading the way. Harry noticed the Weasleys walking not far behind them as they made their way to the portal into London. On a bench, sitting alone and watching the other families pass her by, was a thin elderly woman with thick glasses. Her hair was short, nearly white, and very curly. She was dressed in a nice suit, with a dark forest green cloak and matching hat. She held a cane in her hands, topped with a silver dragon's head. Upon spotting them, the elder woman got to her feet a little shakily and smiled a warm, proud smile as her two granddaughters rushed forward to greet her with hugs and kisses. "Oh, my little flowers. How much you've bloomed," the elder woman said in a thick Romanian accent, taking each girl's chin and examining them carefully and blissfully. "I have missed you both so very much." "I can't believe you're here, Nana." Astoria grinned. And Daphne nodded her own joy at seeing her grandmother. The elder woman smiled again at each of them and then turned her attention to the black-haired boy who stood patiently just behind Mrs. Greengrass. The slender old woman gave a tender smile as she gazed upon the boy. "Well, by the fates. It is indeed an immense pleasure to see you again after so many years." The elder woman stepped forward, hand outstretched to Harry. "Annabel Greengrass, and you are, most certainly, Harry Potter." "Yes, ma'am," Harry said, taking Annabel's gloved hand. "Such a strong handshake. You'll do well in this world, mark my words." Annabel grinned, taking Harry's arm and leading the group through the portal. "You do resemble your grandfather." "Has anyone ever told you that?" "No, ma'am. Usually they just say I look like my father, with my mother's eyes," Harry said softly. "Indeed. Well, I am very excited to have the chance to talk to you again. Please tell me you received my invitation, and you'll be joining us on Christmas." The eldest Greengrass woman could not stop smiling at the boy. "I will. I have so many," Harry began, but Daphne's grandmother cut him off. "Questions?" "Yes, I know you do. But we must be patient. Now, I really must get all my girls home and find out how they have been doing." Annabel smiled over at the three Greengrass women. "I know that my son is quite anxious to meet you as well, but his business has kept him today. Be assured he will be home on Christmas, and we will all have a very nice chat then. Now, say goodbye to Daphne, and we will see you soon." Harry couldn't help but return the old woman's smile. It was so infectious. She pulled the younger of the Greengrass girls with her, and Daphne's mother looked away as Harry turned to Daphne, who looked as nervous as he felt at the moment. Well, I'll see you then." Harry gave an awkward smile. "Yes. Have a good holiday." Daphne smiled back, and they shook hands. Harry gave another smile and joined the Weasleys, who had been waiting just out of the way, but close enough to move in if something had happened. "My word," the elder Mrs. Greengrass proclaimed, looking affronted at her granddaughter. "Is that how you say goodbye to a boy? You don't start on me, Nana," Daphne warned. "It's been a tough term, okay. Well, I'm anxious to hear all about it. Annabel said, taking both her granddaughters by the shoulders and guiding them into London, with their mother close behind them. Can someone please explain why Harry was speaking to the Greengrass family? Molly Weasley asked as Harry joined them. Mrs. Weasley, it's a really long story, and I'd rather not talk about it here in public, if you don't mind. Harry said weakly. Very well. It's getting late. Best to be off, then. Mrs. Weasley said, a bit upset at being shut down by a 16-year-old boy. Molly Weasley had heard many nasty things about the Greengrass family over the years, none of which were flattering. She eyed Harry carefully as they made their way out of King's Cross Station. She felt like a mother to the boy, so she had become quite protective over him, as she was with her own children. She would get to the bottom of this new mystery. After all, this was the year Harry and Ginny were going to get together. So, Daphne's grandmother smiled sweetly at her eldest granddaughter. They were sitting in Daphne's bedroom the day after the girls had arrived home. Dinner the night before had been a quiet affair as both Daphne and her younger sister had been very tired from their journey. Astoria had gone with her mother to do some shopping that morning, while Mr. Greengrass had left early to meet with another of his business contacts. Daphne suspected it had all been arranged to give her and her grandmother some time alone. You must tell me about the young man. Her grandmother spoke in her thick Romanian accent, her eyes sparkling, making her smile even more childlike. There's not much to tell, really. Daphne shrugged. He's a nice enough boy, but not much more than that. We've been taking time to get to know one another, but there's nothing there, really. I see. Annabel nodded slowly, still watching her granddaughter. You feel nothing for the boy who is to be your husband one day? Daphne avoided the knowing eyes of her grandmother, as she said quite unconvincingly. Nothing special. Is that why you got so nervous when you said farewell yesterday? Or why you avoid my eyes now? Daphne's head shot up so fast she gave herself whiplash. Annabel began chuckling mildly. It was the same for me, you know. I was very upset to learn I had been betrothed. You and Papa were betrothed. Daphne looked odd. Oh, yes, child. I did not find out until a year before it was to happen. I was very lucky. Your grandfather was very handsome, and kind. We fell in love very quickly. I practically ran down the aisle to be wed to him. You know, it was I who urged your mother and father to tell you. They did not want to do it, but I kept insisting that if they did not, they would lose you for good. You're probably right. I doubt I would have ever spoken to them again. Daphne confessed. I thought as much. But, you took their advice and have begun speaking to the boy. I have seen with my own eyes that he is handsome, though not very tidy. I wonder why you believe you feel nothing for him. Is he not kind? Do you have nothing in common at all? Annabel inquired. No. He's very kind. Thoughtful and generous. I enjoy talking with him. But, I don't think he's what I pictured when I dreamt of a husband. Maybe if things were different, you might find him more to your liking. Annabel chuckled again. Daphne gave an irritated expression. I've seen you look at him. My eyes are old, but they still see. There is something there, but you are confused by it. You wonder if it's the contract that binds you to him, or if your heart has grown fond of him. He feels it, too. You can see by how he looks at you. Annabel sighed plaintively. It's so confusing, Nana. Sometimes, when I look at him, I feel this tightening in my stomach. When I know I'm going to see him, I get nervous. Then other times, I loathe the thought of him altogether. Annabel Greengrass nodded slowly, smiling at her granddaughter. Your heart has begun fighting with your head. It happens all the time, but listen to me now. I have told you since you were little that your heart is always right. You must listen to it. Your mind wants to protect you. Rarely do the heart and mind agree, but if you just listen to your heart, no matter what it says, you will find happiness. Is that what happened with you and Papa? Daphne asked wistfully. It is. Child. I never doubted my heart, and I had 25 very happy years with him. Daphne hugged her pillow to her chest as she imagined a life with Harry. The boy had somehow cracked her defenses, though she was loath to admit it to anyone. When she thought of his smile, she did feel something special. She could never put words to it, to make someone understand it, but it was there, and it was wonderful. But it was mired by fear and doubt. Her mind was always coming up with reasons why the two of them didn't make sense. She also was sick to death of her mother sending letters of advice, or Tracy going on and on about how she should open her heart and let whatever happened to just happen. She projected it all onto Harry, aimed her anger at him, though he didn't deserve any of it. But when her grandmother, the one person she cherished above all others, gave her the same advice, Daphne couldn't help but heed the words and really consider them. But, was it the contract causing her feelings, or was she actually becoming attracted to the boy of her own volition? She looked at her grandmother for a long time, her eyes beginning to tear up from her own frustrated confusion. The old woman gave a very tender smile to the teary-eyed girl. "Oh, my precious Blossom," she said as she stood to embrace her poor granddaughter. "You are so much like your father. You think too much for your own good." Holidays at the Burrow was one of Harry's most favorite things in the world. Usually, anyway. Summer had always been fun, with little more to do than fly a broom, or enjoy the sunshine while discussing nothing so important than Quidditch teams with Ron. But this visit was very different, and it was beginning to tax on Harry's nerves. He had never had Christmas at the Burrow before, but had often heard stories about how special they were. But his own experience was not living up to the legends. In fact, Harry was wishing he were back at school. Mrs. Weasley had become a little too protective of him lately. She seemed to want him close to her, or at least somewhere she could see him. She was constantly calling on him to help her out with various chores. It was as if she was waiting for him to change, or keel over. Harry even noted that Fleur had begun taking far less abuse from the family matriarch. On top of that, she had not stopped in her quest to learn why Harry was now associating with the Greengrass family. Whenever she could get him next to her, the topic would inevitably come up. She had even questioned Ron at length in private about it. Ron's father had rescued his youngest son before it had gotten too bad. But Ron could not look his mother in the eye for the rest of the holiday. Even Ginny had been taken temporary hostage and questioned by the Weasley matron. Harry had learned from both Ron and Ginny that their mother was sure he had been placed under the Imperious Curse or something. Ginny even revealed that her mother had urged her to approach Harry in a romantic way. This had led to the biggest fight Harry had ever witnessed, with Ginny threatening to follow Percy's example. Harry felt terrible for being the cause of so much friction within the Weasley household. He could think of no reason not to share his situation with Mrs. Weasley, but he remained quiet on the subject. He felt as if he'd somehow ruined the holiday for everyone, as Mrs. Weasley's bad temper was starting to infect others. Harry gave serious thought into just spilling his secret and hoping it would cause the woman to finally ease up on everyone so they could enjoy the holiday. It was Ron who dissuaded him. "Mate, you have to understand, Mum really believes the gossip she hears. She never really leaves the house unless she has to. The magazines she reads are nothing but gossip and half-truths. You do remember how she treated Hermione during fourth year, right? All because of Rita's articles. Until she is shown that the stuff she believes is untrue, she'll hold onto it as if Merlin himself wrote it. So, Harry kept silent, counting down the hours until he could escape and meet with Annabel Greengrass and learn more about the contract. He had been haunted by a question Daphne had asked him. What if there's a way out of it? Harry had no answer. If the contract could in fact be broken, what would he do? Ginny had already told him she didn't feel that way about him, and his feelings for her had begun fading the more he saw of Daphne. There was of course loads of girls in Hogwarts, but none really captivated his attentions. He wondered, if there was a way to break the contract, if he really wanted that any more. Harry had been able to speak to Fred and George, and enlist their help in sneaking away. The twins were more than happy to cause a major distraction so Harry might be able to get away. The fact that they had not asked questions made Harry appreciate the twins even more. And so, when the sun rose over a fresh blanket of snow on the Burrow on Christmas morning, Harry anxiously waited the clock to strike noon. The morning was quite a change from the past week since they'd gotten back from Hogwarts. With the exception of Percy, all the Weasleys were home. This gave Mrs. Weasley a lot of distraction already, as she'd not seen Charlie in several years. Presents were passed around and opened, and breakfast was a feast for kings, as it typically was, but this one seemed a little more special than usual. After breakfast, the family occupied themselves with their new gifts, conversations, games, or helping Mrs. Weasley in the kitchen with preparing the Christmas dinner. As the noon hour approached, Harry and Ron positioned themselves in front of the fireplace, appearing to play chess. As the clock on the mantel struck 12, there came a gut-wrenching, earth-shaking boom from above. The house erupted in chaos, with redheads screaming and running to find the source of the explosion. Ron stood, as did everyone else. But he blocked the fireplace with his body as Harry took a fistful of Floo powder and tossed it into the grate. He stepped into the flames and said clearly, "Greengrass Manor." And, in a flash of brilliant green flame, he was gone, nearly unnoticed. The fire at Greengrass Manor sprung up and turned emerald green as Harry Potter came crashing to the floor, sputtering and coughing out ash. Right on time, clapped a very pleased Annabel Greengrass. She leaned heavily on her cane as she offered Harry a helping hand up. "Not too good with Floo travel, are you, young man? I actually prefer a broom." Harry grinned slightly, brushing more soot off of himself. "I have heard you are quite talented upon a broom." "Never got the knack of it myself. Though I always loved being swept off my feet." The old Romanian woman grinned, patting Harry's shoulder. "Come, they are waiting." She motioned for Harry to follow. The house was amazing. Unlike Grimmauld Place, this house was warm and bright. The dark-stained wood walls were decorated with portraits and medieval weapons. The floor was a bright red carpet, which felt soft under his trainers. Harry passed a glass case where many old wands sat on display, and another which contained loads of different knickknacks. As they journeyed deeper into the house, Harry could hear cheery voices. 3 distinct female and 1 gruff male. He followed the elder woman into a drawing room where Daphne sat along with her parents and sister, who looked shocked to see Harry Potter in her house. "That's the guest?" she asked in astonishment, pointing rudely at Harry. "Yes, dear one," Annabel said with a smile. "You do know it's very rude to point and stare," she chided. Astoria looked chastised, and smiled apologetically. "It's all right. I'm rather used to it." Harry smiled softly. "Doesn't make it any less rude," Annabel said, smiling, yet shaking her head at Astoria. "As it is, this conversation is not for you, dear Astoria. Please give us some privacy." Astoria looked as if she wanted to protest, but a sharp look from her grandmother made the complaint die in her throat. Astoria stood and hugged her parents before leaving the drawing room. Please allow me to introduce my son, Jonathan Greengrass. Annabel waved to the man, who now stood offering his hand in greeting. It is a pleasure, young master. I trust you are well. Mr. Greengrass said with a firm handshake. Yes, sir, it's nice to finally meet you. Daphne's told me a bit about you. I can imagine it didn't paint me in a pretty light, as she's been rather angry with us. Mr. Greengrass looked to his daughter, who was a mask of calm. Actually, she spoke quite fondly of the both of you. Harry said, looking to Mrs. Greengrass, who sent a pleased smile at her eldest daughter. Shall we all sit? We have much to discuss. Annabel waved at the sofa and chairs, as she made for the seat her son had just vacated. I know you have questions, but allow me to tell this story, and then I shall answer any questions as best I can. Harry nodded, and Annabel took a deep breath. As you know, there aren't many pure-blood families left. Many of them are too prejudiced and stubborn to understand that times have changed. They believe in keeping the bloodlines pure. So, options for marriage are quite limited. If you look down any pure-blood family tree, you'll see it doesn't branch off very much. Daphne's grandfather, Archibald, wished to keep the family pure, yet, did not wish to mingle with certain other families. He felt many of the bloodlines had become too polluted by their own hands, what with all the inter-family marriages. As you can imagine, that left very few options. Finding a pure-blood family that hadn't tainted itself with folks marrying their cousins was proving quite a feat. Annabel chuckled at her little joke, looking at the two young teens, who were listening closely. The ideal match would have been an ancient house, but that was simply not possible. Then, Archibald met a man named Reginald Potter. While his family was pure blood, it was still relatively young, but your grandfather was willing to forgive that as it was a pure blood family who had not yet contaminated themselves by inbreeding. And so, a deal was struck. But, only boys were born to each family. Annabel smiled at the two youngsters, while Harry heard Daphne's father give a slight chuckle. So, a new contract was written. But only after the next generation was born. Both your grandfathers were proud men, and neither wanted to back out of the deal they had struck. This caused a tumultuous amount of friction within the families. While I don't know much about the Potters' troubles, Archibald and Jonathan fought like dragons over the matter. Finally, Archibald did something that I never forgave him for. Something that even he could never forgive himself for. He obliviated his son, and his son's wife, just before the contract signing. What? Mr. Greengrass shot forward in his seat. He what? Harry saw Mrs. Greengrass reach out and clutch her husband's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. I'm sorry. Annabel looked sadly at her son. He did it before I knew it had happened. I could do nothing to stop it. I have carried the secret for years, and I do not expect forgiveness. I am simply telling you the story. Annabel looked ready to break down and cry, but she took a deep, calming breath and continued on. I know that you both want to know what each family gained from this merger. And I do wish I could tell you for certain. I only know that gold changed hands, but it was an insignificant amount. What I believe was done was an allegiance. The Potter family gained a significant amount of power in our government, and it also made them targets. That contract became a death sentence for Reginald and his family. Daphne looked to Harry, who stared now at the floor, looking for all the world as if he wished he'd never come. But my mother was Muggle-born. I'm only half-blood. Harry pointed out. If your husband was trying to protect the bloodline, you know, keep it pure. Wouldn't my father's choice in wife make your husband rethink the agreement? You're only half-blood. Annabel looked surprised. You didn't know. Harry asked, looking strangely at the old woman, who had begun to smile. I did not know. How interesting. Annabelle seemed to be rather pleased. I never cared for blood purity. All one has to do is to look at the most ancient houses to see that blood counts for nothing. Many of the offspring from those houses are little more than glorified squibs. They have all but bred the magic out of their bloodlines. So this whole mess has to do with blood purity. Daphne spoke up for the first time. She looked angry. I'm afraid so, dear one. Annabelle said softly. So, the two of us are stuck together because of pride and blood. Blood which isn't even pure anymore. Jonathan, Aurora, may I speak to these two alone? Annabelle asked of the adults. Both of Daphne's parents smiled politely and left the elder woman with the two teens. Once the door was shut, Annabelle turned to look compassionately upon the youths. I know you're both angry. And you have every right to be. When I found out I was betrothed, I was ever so angry. No one should have their choices taken away from them. But, the fact remains that you two are linked now. Learn from your ancestors' mistakes. I sense a great power hidden inside of you, Harry. All one has to do is to peer into your eyes and they can see it as well. And dearest Daphne, I have watched you grow from a clumsy, awkward child into a fine, strong, and incredibly intelligent woman. What the two of you could accomplish together is nothing short of amazing. But, you both need to look past the burden of the contract and focus on one another. The two teens both burned crimson at this statement, each avoiding the other's eyes. You've begun to feel strange emotions, and you can't decipher if they are yours, or because of the contract. Learn from each other, let your hearts guide you. Don't fight what you feel for each other. Forget there is a contract. Concentrate on your friendship. Allow those feelings you question to grow. The old woman looked fondly at the pair. She pointed her cane at Daphne, smiling sincerely. I've often told you to follow your heart. I give you the same advice, young man. At this she stood up. I am in need of a cup of tea. I trust one can leave you alone together without concern. Annabelle gave one of her little knowing smiles and left the two teens alone. There was silence for a long time, as each of them processed what they had learned. I'm sorry, Harry. Daphne said softly. What? Why? Harry looked a little confused. For all of this. I know it's not my fault any more than it's yours, but I just needed to say it. She looked into his bright green eyes. You heard your grandmother. This was done to us. It's up to us to decide what we make of it. Harry stood, and began pacing about the room. Daphne watched him for a few moments. What do we do from here? She asked softly. I don't have any answers. Harry stopped and stared at a portrait of a sleeping dragon. Everyone expects me to know what to do, but I don't. Daphne stood and came to his side. She stared at the painting too, as if the dragon might awaken and tell them what they should do. I want to be loved. Daphne nearly whispered. I want to love someone and have the happiness I see in my parents' eyes when they look at each other. I'm sorry. Harry said sadly. I wish I could tell you you're going to have those things. I guess we could use love potions on each other. Daphne started to chuckle, and after a few seconds it turned into a full-blown laugh, which made her fall into a chair, holding her stomach and wiping her eyes. Harry couldn't stop himself from joining her. I can just picture you trying to slip me a potion at the same time I'm trying to slip you one. Daphne mimed the scene, which caused Harry to stumble with laughter. Don't get up, I'll get you a drink, my love. Harry grimaced with his own laughter as he mimed slipping Daphne a potion. They laughed hard for a long time until they were both exhausted. and had to avoid looking at each other for fear of breaking into fresh fits of giggles. "I suppose we'll figure it all out as we go," Harry finally said after they had calmed down. He sat up from the floor where he'd fallen, and found Daphne looking at him strangely. Her eyes were bright from their laughter, and she was regarding him almost fondly. She stood with him, and approached him. Harry was taken aback when she wrapped her arms around him and embraced him tightly. "Thank you, Harry. I don't know if many blokes would be so rational in this same scenario. A lot of them would think of me as their property and try to take advantage or something. You've been nothing short of a gentleman through it all. I don't know what's going to happen any more than Trelawney can predict the weather, but I will never do anything to hurt you. Not on purpose, anyway." Harry smiled. He glanced at the clock and a deep feeling of guilt overtook him. "I should really get back. Mrs. Weasley's probably had kittens by now. Well, at least come say goodbye. Nana never forgives rudeness. It's her pet peeve." Daphne led Harry back to the fireplace he'd come through where Annabelle and Mrs. Greengrass were sitting, enjoying tea. "Leaving us so soon?" Annabelle said a bit sadly. "I had hoped you might stay for dinner. I'm sorry, but I kind of snuck out. I'm sure the Weasleys are worried. Well, I do hope we get the chance to talk again, and soon." Harry shook the old woman's hand gratefully. "Thank you for clearing up a lot of this mystery. Before you go, there is one thing you must attend to, Mr. Potter." "What's that?" Harry asked, feeling suddenly nervous. Annabelle Greengrass cast her eyes to a spot just above her granddaughter, who also looked up. There, floating lazily, was a fresh sprig of mistletoe. Both Harry and Daphne's faces suddenly burned crimson, as they turned to see Annabelle trying to hide her laughter. "Nana!" Daphne shrieked in embarrassment. Harry turned back to look at the mistletoe, hoping it had been an apparition, a trick of the firelight. "Annabelle, what are you doing to these poor children?" Mrs. Greengrass asked. Looking ashamed of the giggling old woman. "I'm afraid you must tend to the matter. Some traditions are too wonderful to break." Annabelle smiled mischievously as she began ushering a protesting Mrs. Greengrass out of the room. "I'm so sorry about this." Daphne groaned. "I'm sure she's watching to make sure that you..." Daphne tried, but couldn't finish the sentence. Harry rubbed his hands through his hair, trying to calm down his racing heart. "You really think she's watching?" he asked, looking to the closed door in which the old woman had briskly fled through. "And she'll come right back in here to prevent you from leaving." Daphne sighed. She looked at Harry, and the moment he aimed his eyes into hers, her stomach flipped, and her palms went cold. Her grandmother was right. One simply had to peer into those magnificent emerald orbs to see the power in Harry Potter. The two teens stared blankly at one another. Neither noticed that they had begun drawing closer. It felt as if an eternity were passing between them as, closer and closer, they drew in. Daphne could never ever describe it to anyone. She would try on many occasions, but she would never truly be able to communicate the feeling of exhilaration and passion she felt in the moment when Harry's lips tenderly touched hers. He was so soft, only caressing her lips with his. She felt her hands move to his chest, almost as if she were going to push him off, but instead she tugged his jumper closer. Their kiss deepened and her arms snaked up around his neck, holding him close. Harry had only ever kissed one other girl, but he couldn't remember it being this wonderful. Daphne's lips felt amazing against his, and when her arm slipped around his neck, his heart felt like it might burst right out of his chest. The two teens finally broke apart and simply stared at each other, before Harry finally slipped from Daphne's grasp and used the floor. Daphne watched him disappear into the flames and felt a sudden hole in her existence. Was this what Tracy had been talking about? Had she just learned all she ever needed to know about the boy in that moment, Daphne could barely breathe. It was as if something precious that she had only discovered had been violently torn away from her. Her heart was pounding so hard in her chest that she actually feared it might explode. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts. There was a virtual whirlwind of emotions that she couldn't even begin to fathom. Except one: irritation, anger, a deep and unrelenting desire to curse someone for meddling in her affairs. And, as she smiled to herself, Daphne knew that it was one emotion she could actually do something about. "Oh, Nana! Where have you been?" That was the shriek that greeted Harry as he fell out of the fireplace into the home of the Weasleys. Mrs. Weasley looked ready to murder Harry where he lay, and he was more than shocked to see Albus Dumbledore and Remus Lupin there as well, both looking relieved at his reappearance. "Merry Christmas, Remus, Professor Dumbledore." Harry smiled sheepishly as he got to his feet. "And to you, Harry," Dumbledore said, a hint of mild irritation at the boy in his voice. "May I inquire where you have been for the past few hours?" "Greengrass Manor," Harry said. He felt telling the truth was far better at this moment. Besides, he couldn't think of a very good lie. "What?" Mrs. Weasley's face was as red as a tomato. "Why would you go there? We've been so worried about you. How could you be so insensitive? So unthoughtful. I had to go. I promised I would." Harry looked agitated. "To the green grass. They could have delivered you to you-know-who." "They wouldn't do that," Harry snapped. "What makes you so sure? What guarantee do you have that they would not take you straight to their master?" Mrs. Weasley snapped back. "I'm quite sure they wouldn't do that. I'm engaged to their daughter after all." Harry looked determinedly at the woman who had been so kind and loving to him over the years. He cared a great deal for Mrs. Weasley, but she had gone too far. The silence that fell was like a bombshell. Mrs. Weasley's hand went to her chest as she seemed to be trying to understand what Harry had just said. Mr. Weasley's eyebrows had raised so high on his forehead that Harry thought they would have disappeared if he still had a decent head of hair. Remus and Dumbledore both looked understanding, but still angry over Harry's sneaking off. "Way to go, Harry." It was Fred. He and George had been standing just out of his line of sight, but had come out to where he could see them, along with Ginny and Ron, who both looked happy that Harry had finally let the secret out. Though Ron also looked a little frightened of what might be coming. "How did you land one of the hottest witches in all of England?" George asked, reaching out to shake Harry's hand in congratulations. "You're too young," Mrs. Weasley roared, finally finding her voice again. "Oi, mate. You've stirred the beast," Fred said in an undertone. "How could you be so immature and foolish?" Mrs. Weasley stormed forward, getting right up to Harry, her face scarlet with rage. "For your information, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said calmly, his eyes boring into the woman now. "I didn't do it. It was done to me." "Well, then you must fix it." "Break up with the Scarlet Woman." "I can't." "You most certainly can. You have no need to be noble this time. She's obviously charmed you or something." "We will set this right," Molly said with conviction. "Mrs. Weasley," Harry shouted, finally getting the woman to stop her tirade. "I can't break it off. I told you it was done to me, but I never said that Daphne did it. It was a betrothal contract, signed by both my parents. I have no choice in the matter. And, even if I did, I'm not so sure I'd want to walk away from her. Not anymore." Harry didn't miss the slight twinge on Dumbledore's lips, as if he were fighting a smile. He also noted that Remus looked almost proud. Harry simply shook it off and refocused on Mrs. Weasley, who looked, for all the world, lost. Mrs. Weasley's eyes began to tear up and she quickly left the room. Harry saw Ron watch his mother run off, and turned back to Harry. He gave a slight nod, and Harry could see how tired his friend looked. Harry realized that he must have been all but tortured by his mother to reveal Harry's whereabouts. He felt a swell of pride at his best friend. "Why not ask me to help?" Dumbledore asked, bringing Harry's attention back to the matter at hand. "I could have provided a proper escort. I wonder why you felt the need to put yourself in danger again." Harry sighed heavily and clenched his fists. "I'm not a little kid anymore. My entire life has been a series of decisions that I had no part in. I'm sick of it. I want to make a few choices in my life. I would like to speak with Harry alone for a moment," Dumbledore announced, and the others in the room slowly wandered out. Leaving Harry and the headmaster alone, Dumbledore sat down in one of the chairs in the Weasley living room and stared at the young man before him. "I have had the privilege of watching you grow into a very strong-minded, powerful, and intelligent young man, Harry. So I am truly confused as to where this anger is coming from. Professor, in the last 8 months, I have lost the closest thing to a father I have ever known. I led my friends to near death, because you were keeping vital information from me. I learned that I am destined to kill or be killed by the monster that killed my parents. I have met the woman I'm going to marry, because of some stupid contract that was supposed to keep a pure bloodline going. And I've been learning that Voldemort was a charming and charismatic man. But nothing has helped me. I've not learned how I'm going to defeat him. I've not learned any secret spell, or special chant that would destroy Voldemort and allow me to live. So you tell me, Professor. What reason would I have for being angry?" "I see." Dumbledore nodded sadly. "You believe my method of teaching is too slow. You believe what I have to show you is unimportant. I never said that, sir. I just don't understand why you can't just get to the point, and we can move forward. Isn't this far too important to dance around? Isn't defeating Voldemort more important than anything any of us do? What about trying to keep you alive so you have a chance at the life you wish for?" Dumbledore countered. "Is it more important than that? Sir, no offense, but you just made my point for me." Harry gave a little grin. "Wouldn't just telling me all this stuff, instead of having me jump through all these hoops, be a better use of our time? Wouldn't telling me everything you know and teaching me something useful be better than going through all this sleight of hand? What if the lesson is lost on me because you thought I was smart enough to figure it out? And I wasn't." Dumbledore's shoulders seemed to sag a bit as his bright blue eyes considered Harry for a very long moment. Finally, he took a deep breath and answered Harry. "Very well. Tell me, have you procured the memory from Professor Slughorn yet?" Harry eyed the old man, and shook his head slowly. "Then let me offer you this compromise. You bring me that memory, as it is key to finally solving a puzzle that we must have the answer to, and I will, as you say, get to the point. Is that acceptable?" "Fine. I will get the memory as soon as we get back to school, and then we can move forward and finally end all of this." Dumbledore stood, looking proud. "I had hoped to teach you independence, Harry. I wanted you to become self-sufficient. I see it is working, but let me remind you that you have people around you who care deeply for you, who only wish to help. It would not do to alienate them, especially when you need them now more than you realize." Dumbledore smiled and swept out of the room, leaving Harry behind to contemplate the old man's advice. Harry and Ron had made their way to Ron's bedroom late Christmas night. After Dumbledore and Remus had left, Harry had been subjected to a barrage of questions from the Weasley family regarding his escape and choice of destination. Both Bill and Charlie were very curious how Harry had slipped away completely unnoticed. Fred and George were very proud of their distraction, as it was a product they had been perfecting over 2 years. They were at last able to introduce the newest Weasley wizard Wheeze, the decoy detonator. Mrs. Weasley had remained in her bedroom the rest of the evening, which suited Harry fine, as he didn't think he could face her again. He truly respected Mrs. Weasley for all she had done, but over the past few days, he had seen a different side of her, he'd never experienced before. She seemed truly distraught about Harry's engagement to Daphne, as if she had other plans for him or something. As if he needed anyone else making decisions regarding his life. Though Harry had been angry at Mrs. Weasley, he still cared for her, and had felt a little bad at how he'd spoken to her. Mr. Weasley assured him, however, that sometimes you had to hurt in order to get your point across, and that Mrs. Weasley had more than likely forgiven him already. The strangest part of his evening had come when Ginny had placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling sweetly. Daphne Greengrass, huh? Harry could only shrug. As he looked at Ginny now, he no longer felt any sort of romantic feelings at all. All he saw now was a good friend. Harry wondered if he felt differently now that he'd actually kissed Daphne, or if his feelings for Ginny had simply faded on their own. "Can I give you a bit of advice, Harry?" Ginny asked. Harry nodded and Ginny looked him square in the eye as she said, "Don't try and be who she thinks you ought to be. Be honest with yourself, and don't let her run your life." Ginny smiled as she left Harry pondering the meaning of her advice. Daphne never tried to run things. Okay, she had demanded that he get hold of the contract, but he would have done the same if the situation were reversed. Daphne had also been the one to say that they should try getting to know each other, but Harry had been thinking about it anyway. Other than that, Harry and Daphne's budding relationship had been pretty equal. Did Ginny know something Harry had yet to learn? "I hope they didn't rough you up too badly," Harry said to Ron as they settled into their beds much later. The redhead merely shook it off and grinned. "Actually, it was a bit cool. I felt like a spy or something." Harry chuckled at his friend. "In all honesty, they might not have noticed you were gone at all if it hadn't been for Rufus Scrimgeour." "The Minister of Magic?" Harry looked confused. "The one and only. He showed up with Percy about 20 minutes after you'd left." Ron sat up in his bed to look at his friend. "It was weird. Mum cried, thanking Merlin that Percy'd come home, and the minister asked to speak with you. I think he'd had some other plan, but since he didn't see you anywhere, he just had to lay it out. Dad said that you were busy, but Mum insisted that I fetch you. I kind of got the feeling that Dad knew you were gone, but he never said anything." "So what happened?" Harry was on the edge of his seat. "I had to tell Mum you weren't here." Ron looked guiltily. "Percy got angry at the minister, saying that he had told him it was a stupid idea, and that got both Bill and Charlie angry. They started shouting at Percy and Percy shouted back. Then Ginny got angry and tried to punch Percy. Mom began crying, and Dad tried to calm everyone down, but I think it was too late by then. I'm not sure who threw the first handful of potatoes, it might have been me, it's all real fuzzy. But when the dust settled, Percy left wearing most of what should have been dinner. So that's why we had sandwiches for dinner." Harry fell back onto his own bed, a slight grin on his face as he imagined Percy leaving the burrow covered in food. "Did the minister say what he wanted with me?" "Nope. Just kept trying to calm everyone down and avoid flying food. After they left, well, Mum flew Dumbledore, and you pretty much know the rest of it." "What happened, anyway? You were gone a while, I mean." "Not much. I met Annabelle Greengrass, Daphne's grandmother. She nice, but I think she might be a little crazy. Anyway, she told us all she knew about the contract. We were set up to keep the bloodline pure. Apparently, my grandfather lied about my mum's blood status to make sure the contract got signed. The Greengrasses didn't know I was a half-blood. Do you know what was exchanged? I mean, what did they get out of the deal? A little gold, but Mrs. Greengrass didn't really know for sure. She reckons there might have been some political gain as well. Power in the government or something. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, mate, really. Ron looked genuinely remorseful over Harry's predicament. It's all right. Not much we can do about the past. Harry groaned. So, what did Daphne get you for Christmas? Ron smiled, trying to change the subject. Harry smiled lightly as he remembered kissing Daphne before he'd returned to the burrow. He could still taste her faintly on his lips. Sweet, and soft. The way she had wrapped her arms around his neck and drawn him closer to her. It had been like nothing else he'd ever felt. Nothing. He finally said. She didn't get me anything. Too bad. Ron grinned. Not really. I didn't get her anything, either. Harry shrugged. He lay back, closing his eyes, and reliving the kiss again. Harry now wondered if there was a future for he and Daphne. He tried to contemplate a life where they could actually love each other. Daphne's grandmother's advice replayed in his mind. What the two of you could accomplish together is nothing short of amazing. But you both need to look past the burden of the contract and focus on one another. Maybe they could find happiness in each other. Harry grinned. He lived in a world filled with magic, anything was possible. The rest of the holiday passed in a blur of chess games, snowball fights, and homework. Harry had not spoken to Daphne since Christmas, and now, as he, Ron and Ginny were getting ready to board the train back to school, Harry felt more anxious than he ever had before. He was unsure of what would happen when he saw her again. Had their relationship advanced, or was the kiss a one-time thing? He'd been able to think of little else. Every time he closed his eyes, he could swear he felt Daphne's lips brushing against his. This actually had begun to irritate him, as he was so confused by everything he felt now. He had wanted to write to her, to ask her about her feelings now, but he felt stupid every time he pulled out fresh parchment and starting writing. Nothing he wrote made any sense, or it seemed as if he repeated himself, or babbled. Harry had refused to talk about it with Ron or Ginny. Partly because he was sure they couldn't understand, but also because he feared the inevitable teasing he would be the target of. So, he'd been stuck, impatiently waiting until he could talk to someone who might be able to give him some decent advice without teasing him. So, as Mrs. Weasley gave her two children tight hugs, Harry was scanning the crowds for any sign of the blonde Slytherin girl he was betrothed to. Harry actually felt a pang of heartache when Mrs. Weasley didn't try to hug him. His relationship with the Weasley matriarch had all but disintegrated since Christmas. Harry had tried a couple of times to apologize, but Mrs. Weasley would always excuse herself before Harry could say he was sorry. Harry had even gone to Mr. Weasley to see if he could help. "I'm sorry, Harry. But she was truly hurt by your outburst. While I still believe you were right, I can't help you here. Molly had hopes that you and Ginny would one day figure things out, and that you would become a true part of the family. This has hit her really hard." "Harry!" a voice screamed as two arms went around him, crushing him. And his vision was blurred by a mess of brown frizzy hair. "Hello, Hermione. How was your holiday?" "Hermione." Mrs. Weasley stole Hermione away, hugging her tightly. I'm so happy for you and Ron. Thank you, Mrs. Weasley. Was your holiday good? Hermione said shakily, as Ron took her hand in his. Harry saw them share a smile before Mrs. Weasley asserted herself again. Oh, yes. We had a bit of bother on Christmas, but the rest of the holiday was fine. Mrs. Weasley said, as she eyed Harry. Hermione followed her glance, and frowned. Harry shook his head, and picked up his bag. I'll just go find a cabin, he said, mostly to himself. Harry found a cabin near the back of the train, and shoved his bag in the overhear rack. He sat down heavily and stared out the window. He pushed all thoughts of Molly Weasley out of his mind. He had more important things to think on. The first was how to procure the memory that Professor Slughorn had that was so damned important to Dumbledore. How would he be able to trick the potions master into relinquishing a memory that he wouldn't give to Dumbledore? This was a vexing problem. He had no leverage to work with. What he needed was a brilliant idea. There you are, Hermione said as she and Ron stepped into Harry's cabin. What did you do that got Mrs. Weasley so angry? That's kind of a long story, Harry said sheepishly. We've got the time, Harry. It's a long trip back to Hogwarts. Can we wait on it? Just for a bit? He asked. I need your help. I've got to get that memory from Slughorn, and I have no idea how to do it. Finally taking Dumbledore's request seriously, huh? Hermione looked pleased. No, actually. We've made a deal, Harry remarked, wiping Hermione's smug smile from her face. Before Harry could launch into the details, the cabin opened again and Tracy Davis looked in hopefully. Hi. She smiled. Do you all mind if? No, of course not. Harry waved Tracy in. Have you seen Daphne? Yes. She told me to come find you all. She's just saying goodbye to her parents and then she should be along. Tracy smiled as she sat next to Hermione. What do you mean you made a deal? Hermione asked irritably. I'll explain it all in a bit. Harry snapped. Tracy looked between the two as if she were afraid they might start throwing curses. Just be patient, Hermione. Ron sighed, reaching up to rub her back. There's a lot you have to hear, and I'm guessing Harry doesn't want to repeat it all. Here you are. Daphne smiled as she finally stepped into the cabin, just as the train began moving. I knew I should have looked back here first. Harry felt his body tense as Daphne smiled at him. Her smile was gentle, warm. It was unlike any smile he'd ever seen her wear. It actually reached her eyes, which seemed to shine with something he couldn't put into words. Something really good. Daphne sat down next to Harry, and patted his hand lightly. Nana sends her regards. Harry gave a small smile and nodded. You were right, she was fun. Evil, but fun. What happened? Hermione nearly screamed. What's got her knickers in a twist? Daphne asked, looking oddly at the nearly foaming Hermione, who made a face back at Daphne. She waiting for a story? Tracy grinned. All right, now that everyone is here, I'll fill you all in. Harry gave Hermione a significant look, which she obviously ignored. With Ron and Daphne's help, Harry was able to tell them all about what had happened on Christmas. He left out a few minor details, as he didn't want Daphne and Tracy to know too much about his destiny, and to keep him and Daphne from being teased. So Slughorn's got this memory, which is the key piece of this puzzle, that is preventing Dumbledore from just telling you everything. Daphne asked when Harry had finished. Basically. Harry nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from hers. The trouble is I have no clue how to go about getting Slughorn to give me the memory. If he wouldn't give it to Dumbledore, what chance do I have? You need something to bargain with. Something that is going to be too good to pass up. Something that would appeal to his sense of lifestyle. As she spoke, Daphne's smile grew. Well, the solution has been right in front of you. Or rather under you. My bottom. Harry looked like he might be sick. The basilisk. Daphne slapped his arm. Let him harvest it. A man like that is used to a certain lifestyle, and he loves his comforts, but it costs a lot of gold to live like that. I'm sure with an offer like that, he'd sell his soul. You are brilliant. Of course, he'd be all over it. Harry slapped his forehead, as he grinned at the smiling blonde. I don't think you need to buy it from him. Hermione looked a bit offended. I'm sure if you just asked him to help you. No offense, Hermione, but Slughorn isn't just going to help because he's a teacher. Daphne said softly. He's a coward, and if he wouldn't give Dumbledore that memory, whatever it is, it's not good. Daphne's right. Harry said firmly. He was hiding out in a Muggle house. He tried to make it look like he'd been kidnapped or killed. Whatever is in his head, it's something that has him truly afraid of being found by Death Eaters. What about the Draco problem? Tracy asked. Are you still worried what he's up to? Yeah. Harry nodded. But, until I have proof, no one's going to listen to me. Just like normal. He's going to have to really hurt someone before anyone believes me. Well, I believe you. So, what if we could get you the proof? Tracy asked, a sly smirk on her lips. I'm not going to ask you two to get involved in this. Harry shook his head. Why not? Ron said, eyes bulging. Who better to get proof than a couple of people from his own house? Draco wouldn't even suspect them. Because it's dangerous. He's dangerous. Harry argued. Harry, Daphne said gently. Harry turned to look at her. I know you're trying to protect us, but you can't be around us all the time. While I still have my doubts on if Draco's been marked, if he's doing something that could hurt people, I want it to end. Slytherin House doesn't need any more shame. So whether or not you want me involved, I already am. Daphne tilted her head, keeping her eyes locked with his. She saw so much at that moment reflected in his eyes. A desire to see Draco caught at whatever Harry suspected him of. A need to protect those around him, and something else, something that sent a feeling of warm comfort up her arms and into her chest. Harry couldn't respond. There was nothing to say now. Harry knew when he looked into her shining brown eyes that he had no hope of dissuading her. She had planted her feet on this, and she was going to do it, no matter what he said or did. Well, it's obvious who carries the wand in this relationship. Tracy chuckled. Ron and Hermione both burst into giggles. Daphne looked proud of herself, and Harry could only glare at everyone in the cabin. Don't get all sour. Daphne said, reaching up and caressing his cheek softly with the back of her hand. Whoa! Tracy shouted, seeing Daphne touch Harry's face. Something else happened between you two, didn't it? Daphne and Harry looked guiltily at the auburn-haired girl, who was pointing an accusing finger at them. Harry tried to shake his head, while Daphne found the floor rather interesting. I'm going to find out. Tracy threatened. It's better if you just tell me now. Still, Harry and Daphne remained silent, even avoiding looking at each other. Tracy sat back, folding her arms across her chest, looking suspicious. Fine, have it your way. she said smugly. The five teens kept up a lively conversation, sharing tales from their holiday and discussing what the remainder of the school year held in store. Harry noticed that Daphne seemed to touch him more. Little things, like clutching his hand when she had something important to share, or the way she seemed to rub his shoulder when Ron or Hermione would tease him. It was puzzling, but nice at the same time. He wanted desperately to ask her about it, but thought it best if he were to wait for a time when they were alone. Daphne had been anxiously awaiting to see Harry again. After he had left on Christmas, she had sought out her grandmother to let her know exactly how she had felt about the mistletoe stunt. Annabel Greengrass could not stop smiling as Daphne shouted. The old Romanian woman simply stood there until Daphne had nearly exhausted herself, and finally admitted to the reason she had done it. Someone had to give you both a little nudge. She had chuckled, as Daphne looked appalled. Yet, the memory of that kiss had haunted her dreams, as well as her waking hours. It was unlike any kiss she'd ever had, not that she had many to compare it with. It was soft, and so full of emotion. The way he had held her as they kissed was something out of a fantasy. He was so gentle, and strong all at once. As wonderful as that moment had been, it was also frightening to her. It had changed their whole dynamic. She had wondered if he would now expect to kiss her, or if he wouldn't want anything to do with her now. He had said nothing as he had left, yet Daphne remembered that he'd been seemingly unable to look away from her. She had not wanted him to leave. She had wanted to hold onto him for as long as she was able, to feel his arms around her. After she'd shouted at her grandmother, her mind began telling her all the reasons she should avoid Harry Potter. Everything she had questioned or fear about becoming involved with him asserted itself in her mind, and yet, the moment she stepped onto platform 9 3/4, the first thing she had done was search for the messy black hair. As they all spoke in the train compartment, she had kept reaching out for his hand, or nudging him with her shoulder. It was like she needed to touch him, to feel him near her. She had also noted that sometimes he shrank away from her touch. It didn't happen all the time. But it was most notable when she had clutched for his hand. The first time, she had thought she had just surprised him. It wasn't a shock, as she had surprised herself with the action. But the second time, she knew there was something going on. Daphne remembered Hermione mentioning long ago that there were aspects of Harry's life that he might be embarrassed about. She also thought it had been strange that Harry never talked about his relatives. Daphne realized there was a problem with Harry's home life, and she had a vital need to learn about it. As she watched him stand up and buy cauldron cakes for all of them, she vowed to herself to really learn all there was about Harry Potter. She also found herself admiring his backside, until Tracy cleared her throat and gave Daphne a knowing grin. Daphne glared back, trying to communicate that Tracy needed to keep her mouth shut. "Wow, Daphne, you seem really entranced by Harry's bum. I wonder if it's charm to memorize girls." Ron nearly choked as he started laughing. Harry turned to see Daphne burying her face in her hands. Tracy was giggling behind her hand, while Hermione looked as if she were trying to look offended while keeping her own laughter in check. She failed a moment later as she bent forward holding her sides. Harry could only shake his head, thinking to himself, "Girls. So when are you going to tell me you guys kissed?" Tracy asked Daphne as they sat down at the Slytherin table for dinner. They had just returned to Hogwarts from Hogsmeade Station. Tracy had been watching Daphne very carefully all the way from London. She was convinced that something major had happened between Harry and her best friend. She had watched as Daphne had taken Harry's hand several times on the train. She hadn't missed the glances or the longing look Daphne had given to the door when Harry had gone to change into his robes. What are you talking about? Daphne asked, looking as if she wished Tracy would just drop the subject. You know me better than anyone, Daph. Are you really going to try and lie? I'm not blind. I saw you on the train. I could practically smell the hormones coming from both of you. All right. Daphne hissed. She glared at her friend, who was practically salivating. You really should consider taking over Rita Skeeter's job when you graduate. Stop flattering me. Tracy was bouncing in her seat. Daphne looked along the table to make sure no one of considerable importance was near them. With a great sigh she admitted, yes, we kissed. Tracy's eyes popped out and her hands went to her wide-open mouth. I knew it. When? How? Tell me. Tracy stammered through her hands. Shut up. Daphne hissed, looking again up and down the table. It never would have happened if my grandmother hadn't gone and messed with us. She conjured mistletoe as Harry was leaving. And you know my grandmother. So, you two had no choice. Tracy deflated slightly. Well, how was it? Daphne sighed, and her eyes became unfocused. Amazing. She said lightly. Then he left, and I didn't see him again until I got on the train. I've been a mess since it happened, and I don't know what to do now. Well, it explains a lot. What do you mean? Daphne looked confused. You and him. You were both stealing looks at each other. Then, whenever you touched him, he looked frightened, but ecstatic at the same time. I'm guessing he's been confused about it all, too. Now, I don't know what to do. If this were a normal situation, I'd ask you, but then you'd tell me to kiss him again and go from there. But, I don't think that's the answer to this. I don't even know if he liked it. Did you? Tracy asked. Daphne looked up, a bit puzzled. The kiss. Did you like it? Daphne didn't answer. Instead she looked across the hall to where a certain black-haired boy sat, eating and talking with other Gryffindors. Daphne imagined he was talking of nothing more important, the Quidditch or schoolwork, and he looked almost happy. Harry looked up and their eyes locked for a moment, and she felt her stomach tighten and her heart beat harder in her chest. She wanted him to hold her again, to kiss her as he had under the mistletoe. He gave a ever so slight smile and nodded almost imperceptibly to her. She wanted to wave, or smile, or something, but all she could do was look away. Strands of blonde silken hair fell into her eyes, and she felt her cheeks burn. Oh, my God, you have got it so bad. Tracy smiled. I don't know what you're talking about. Daphne glowered. She kept her hard stare focused on Tracy for a moment longer until the auburn-haired girl shrugged and went back to her food. Daphne sighed, and looked back to where Harry sat. She watched him for several moments, smiling as he spoke to his housemates. She had come to respect Harry, maybe even liked him in a friendly manner, but she most certainly did not love him. Sure, Harry was a decent-looking guy, and he was polite, and well-mannered. Yes, they had shared a lot together already, and she was admittedly growing fond of him. But there was no way that she loved him. Then what was it I felt when we kissed? She asked herself as she bent her head to hide her eyes, which she felt stinging. Why did I feel so empty when he left, and why was I so anxious to be close to him again? What's happening to me? Several tables away, Harry was being interrogated by several Gryffindor boys about the rumors surrounding he and Daphne. It had started the moment he'd sat down. Seamus, Neville, Colin, and Dennis Creevy and several others had all but surrounded him and began hammering him with questions. How did you get her to thaw out? Have you kissed her? Did you really use a love potion? Seen her in her knickers. Is she the dominant type? Will you perverts just shut up? Hermione hollered after she had her fill of the boys' disgusting questions. Wow, Weasley. Does Granger's bossiness stop at the bedroom? Seamus, I'm only going to warn you once, and then I'm going to make you sing soprano. Ron warned, sending a cold look to his dorm mate, which caused the Irishman to look away quickly. Harry's love life is none of any of your business, so just leave him alone. Hermione said, eyeing each boy carefully. All of them had the good sense to go back to their dinner. Thanks. Harry muttered, looking a bit morose. I hate to say it, but you really should get used to it. Ron said a bit sympathetically. It's going to get worse, you know. Yeah. I do. Harry said as he looked up to see Daphne watching him. He gave a slight smile to her, and a moment later, she lowered her eyes, hiding behind a curtain of blonde hair. Hair he longed to run his fingers through, as he held her warm, enticing body close to his. Harry shook his head, trying to clear the images. It was happening more and more frequently, ever since Christmas. Ever since his lips had touched her soft, sweet lips. Well, now that it's out in the open, so to speak, you two don't have to sneak about. Hermione offered. You can even go to Hogsmeade together on Valentine's Day. She offered. We'll have to wait and see. Harry nodded. This is only the first night back. It's bound to get worse, and I don't know how she's going to handle all the attention we're bound to get. She's done a good job of keeping herself out of the spotlight, so to speak. I don't think she really understands what's going to happen. She's going to get a crash course over the next few days. Ron added. You two are too worried over this. Hermione waved them off. Daphne's a very capable witch, and I'm sure she's more prepared than you think. Besides, Harry, you have something more important to worry about. Getting that memory foam Slughorn. Over the next week, it was all Harry thought about. He was constantly watching for the best scenario in which to approach the portly professor. The prime situation presented itself Friday evening just after dinner. Harry saw Professor Slughorn standing up from the head table and begin to make his way out of the great hall. Harry immediately stood and was beginning to follow when Hermione called out. Harry, are you really going to bribe him? She asked. I know Daphne means well, but it seems really underhanded. Hermione and Harry had this argument several times over the past few days. Hermione's near-blind faith in authority figures doing the right thing had kept her from seeing the truth on many occasions. Harry had argued the point, that while Slughorn was in a position of authority, he was human, and therefore victim to the same weaknesses, in Slughorn's case, greed. Hermione, we've been over this. Slughorn's weakness is his pocketbook. If I'm going to get him to give me what I need, then I need something he wants, or at least a means to getting what he wants. This isn't going to go well. Hermione frowned. I don't have time for this. Harry said, a bit irritated. He turned and left Hermione looking angry and hurt. He'd noticed a change in her behavior since they'd returned to the castle. She was becoming a bit overbearing, and bougier than she'd ever been. Harry hadn't wanted to say it to her, but he was beginning to suspect that Hermione might be a bit jealous of Daphne. For years, Hermione was the only girl in his life. The one he went to for advice or knowledge, and now Daphne was filling that role more and more. Harry wondered if it was going to become a problem and if he should approach both girls on the matter. Hermione was the closest thing to a sister he'd ever had, and he didn't want to lose her friendship, but Daphne was going to be his wife. That, and things were changing between him and the blonde-haired Slytherin girl. Barely a night went by where he hadn't thought of that one beautiful moment. The kiss. Neither of them had spoken of it, but it weighed heavily on Harry's mind. He dreamed of taking her in his arms and kissing her soundly until they couldn't breathe. But Daphne was always so standoffish. There always seemed to be this barrier between them, as if she was trying to keep him at a distance. Harry suspected that part of it was due to the rumors that were going around. They had walked together to Transfiguration on Monday, and it had caused an uproar of whistles, catcalls and very rude comments. Daphne had been careful to avoid him the rest of the week. She slipped a note to him through Hermione saying she would be unable to make it to their normal rendezvous, and Harry had felt extremely heartbroken. Harry was concerned that the atmosphere in the Slytherin house had become rather tough for his betrothed, and she was becoming distant because of it. He hadn't expected anything to happen, but he had been looking forward to seeing her again. He really just wanted to talk to her, like they had before that kiss had changed everything. He missed her perspective, and really could have used her insight with this growing tension between him and Hermione. Harry shoved that all out of his mind as he approached the potions class, where Slughorn was cataloging ingredients and humming to himself. Professor Slughorn. Dahh, the walrus-like man cried as his hands flew up in the air, quill and parchment flying. Harry, boy. You shouldn't be sneaking up on people like that. Oh, my dear, I think I pulled something. Slughorn said, heaving great breaths. I'm truly sorry, sir, but I really need to talk to you. It's very important. Come in, then. What can I do for you? Well, sir, I find myself in a very tricky situation. I'm supposed to ask you for something. Harry watched the man carefully. He had to do this just right, or he'd never get the memory. If I can help you, I'll be more than happy to. Ask away, lad. Slughorn puffed out his chest. Harry closed his eyes. This was it. He had to do this right, or he'd never get Dumbledore to bend on training him. A memory. Slughorn's eyes bulged, and he began looking at the door as if to make a quick escape. Harry saw the man begin to shift his weight nervously and his hands begin to shake. I knew it. I just knew Dumbledore wouldn't let the matter lie. So, it's you, is it? Well, I can't help you. I don't know anything more. There's nothing I can do to help you, so I think it's best if you. What if we could help each other, sir? Harry cut the man off. Slughorn looked up, a strange mix of fear and curiosity on his round face. What are you talking about? What would you say if I could give you access to a very rare animal? One that, if harvested right, could bring in loads of galleons. A basilisk, to be precise. Harry said, not daring to take his eyes off the portly professor. How could you know? I couldn't. A basilisk, really? Yes, sir, I'd guess around 30 feet or so, maybe bigger. Harry nodded. No, I simply can't. Just forget it. I'm not going to fall for some ridiculous trick. A basilisk, really? Slughorn said firmly, though his face betrayed his position. You must take me for some kind of fool. Professor, please. Harry said gently now. I wouldn't even bother you over it if I had my way. Whatever it is, it's very important, and I'm sure you have your reasons for not wanting to share it. I respect that. No. Slughorn shook his head. No, I simply cannot help you. As I said, I don't know any more on the matter. Harry saw that he was digging his heels in firmly. He would have to try another tact. How about this? Harry said, standing up. Think about it. Think about it and come with me right now. We'll go see the basilisk, and you can see for yourself that I'm not trying to trick you. Slughorn studied the young man determinedly for several long moments. He puffed up his chest and gave a dangerous look to Harry. If this is a trick. I swear to you, sir, this is no trick. Just follow me, and you'll see. We could even get another professor to join us if you'd feel safer. That had done it. Harry knew that Slughorn would not want to share potential profits with anyone else if it turned out that he could truly harvest a basilisk. Slughorn waved off the suggestion, and he and Harry journeyed together to the girls' loo on the second floor. It's in the girls' lavatory. Slughorn asked, perplexed. Actually, sir, it's under the girls' lavatory. The Chamber of Secrets was hidden well. Are you serious? The Chamber of Secrets? Yes, sir, I found it in my second year. It's where I killed the basilisk. It's been down there for years. Just rotting. Yes, sir, I have it on good authority that, even though it's quite emaciated, there's still a fortune to be made off of it. Harry smiled as he approached the sink. Moments later, Harry and Slughorn entered the Chamber of Secrets together. Slughorn's greedy eyes bulged from their sockets as he gazed upon the great beast. He strode around the giant serpent, mentally calculating what it might be worth. He was saddened that the eyes were gone, but delighted to see nearly all the teeth still intact. Slughorn knew that there would be at least a gallon of venom still in those teeth, and that alone would buy him 2 houses. It's not in very good shape, Slughorn remarked, leaning in to inspect some of the snake's innards. He could see that most of the organs were degraded significantly, but thought he might be able to salvage a bit of it. He saw that the skeleton was still intact and that would bring a nice price. It's been down here a long time. I only learned this year that it could be harvested. Harry stood watching the man inspect his potential prize. And, you thought I would jump at the chance to get my hands on it, did you? Slughorn said a bit angrily. He turned back to look apprehensively at Harry, who looked a little too satisfied with himself. Why would you give this to me? Why not keep the gold for yourself? Slughorn asked. I don't know that I'll have much use for it, sir. You've read the papers. You know what they're calling me. Ah, yes, the chosen one business. Slughorn nodded, turning back to stare at the lovely galleon mine. It's true, Sir Harry hadn't know why he'd said it. But he felt that if he remained honest with the man, shown him that he bore no ill will to the man, maybe he might budge. Harry had already made significant cracks in the armor, but it hadn't been enough. Are you serious? Slughorn had whirled around so fast, that Harry had been afraid the man might topple over. It isn't just a story to sell papers. There really is a prophecy. It was why my mother was killed. Harry said softly. Slughorn's eyes fell with that revelation. What you've kept in your mind could be the key to avenging her death, and saving our world once and for all. Harry said, closing the distance between himself and the rotund potions master. I need your help, sir. Harry, boy. Slughorn shook his head slowly. If you could only understand. I never meant to do it. He was a student, with a question. He. Slughorn tried to continue, but turned away. It had been my greatest regret. Of course, it wasn't until years after that I realized what I had done. How I had helped him to become what he did. I am deeply ashamed by it all. Then it's time to fix that mistake, Professor. Stop running, stop hiding, and fight back. Take back your life. Harry said as he moved around Slughorn so he could look the man in the eyes. For once in your life, Stop riding the coattails of others, and leave your mark on this world. Slughorn looked up at Harry and his eyes were glistening with determination. You would have made your mother very proud. Very proud, indeed. Harry stepped back as the heavy-set professor removed a small vial from his coat. He uncorked the vial and removed his wand from his pocket, touching it to his temple. As he pulled the wand away, Harry saw silvery strands hanging off the tip, which Slughorn placed in the little vial, and corked. Please, Harry, do not judge me based on what you see. Professor, what you did here tonight, that's what you'll be remembered by. Harry smiled confidently at the tearing man before him. Slughorn nodded, and released the vial into Harry's open hand with a deep sigh of sadness. Hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe.